When a crime is committed, we look to the state for redress. We want legislators to pass laws that protect the citizenry. We want the police to arrest people who break the law. And we want the judiciary to hear the case and, when appropriate, assign punishment in the furtherance of justice. Overnight in 1960, Norman Mailer went from a man who dreamt of being a head of state, mayor of New York City, to someone in police custody for having stabbed his wife. Would the victim in this case, Mailer's wife Adele, get the kind of justice that Mailer, as mayor, would want for every victim of violent assault in New York City? In this fifth episode of A Writer's Crime, we'll examine the legal aftermath of Norman Mailer stabbing his wife Adele. On May 28, 1968, 8 years after Norman Mailer stabbed his wife, Mailer was a guest on the TV program Firing Line, hosted by conservative writer and magazine publisher William F. Buckley, Jr. After an eloquent and at times comical introduction, Buckley asked his guest a pointed question: should artists be immune from the harassments of the law? Mailer answered no, and Buckley elaborated, adducing that in October 1967, Mailer had been arrested during a march on the Pentagon to protest the war in Vietnam. The charge was crossing a police line, and Mailer could have potentially faced 5 days in jail. "I could have stayed in jail for 5 days," Mailer told Buckley, "but looking back on it now, I wanted to get out in 1 day because I had a feeling there was a book in me, and 5 days in jail could take the edge off that book." Mailer went on to talk more about some particulars of his case, the cost of the appeal, and his feelings about it, but Buckley persisted. "Do you, as a general proposition, believe that when you break the law, you should go to jail?" Mailer responded, "Well, that's an enormously complex matter." Mailer added that in his case, he was consciously breaking the law, so of course he should go to jail. Buckley was smart enough to know what he was asking. Buckley surely remembered, even if his audience didn't, that in 1960, after Norman Mailer stabbed his wife, he didn't serve any prison time. As they say on television, he walked. How did that happen? How did it happen that Norman Mailer stabbed his wife, causing her injuries that were very close to being life-threatening, but he served no time? Episode 5. I insist I am sane. Let's return to the early morning of Sunday, November 20th, 1960, when Norman Mailer stabbed his wife Adele Morales Mailer. Shortly after Adele Mailer was taken to a New York hospital, Norman Mailer arrived there. According to nearly every biographical account, Mailer met with Adele's doctor and explained to him the exact location and nature of the knife wounds. Mailer reportedly then said to his family and friends in the waiting room that he had stabbed Adele to relieve her of her cancer. We need to pause here a moment to try to explain what the word cancer meant to Norman Mailer. He was not suggesting that stabbing someone was an effective treatment for cancer. Rather, Mailer used the term cancer in his writing and pontifications to represent the effect that conformist bourgeois culture in America of the 1950s was having on its citizens. Cancer, to Mailer, was a deadening of the soul. It was embodied by plastic. It was mediocrity. That doesn't help explain or make any better Mailer's stated rationale for stabbing his wife. One either believes that Mailer is a philosopher with his own vocabulary and set of definitions, or you believe that he simply is not in his right mind. That Sunday night, according to biographer Mary Dearborn, Norman Mailer came to Adele's hospital room and pleaded with her not to tell the police what had happened. According to Dearborn, a frightened Adele agreed, and later tried to tell the investigating detectives that she received her wounds by falling on broken glass in the kitchen. On Monday, November 21st, Norman Mailer kept an appointment to appear on television to be interviewed by Mike Wallace. At that time, Mike Wallace was not, as he came to be known, a television journalist on the program 60 Minutes. This was simply an interview program for which he was the host. The following passage is from Mike Wallace's 2005 memoir, Between You and Me. I interviewed Norman Mailer again in the fall of 1960, when he was on the verge of announcing his candidacy in the upcoming race for mayor of New York City, a decision based entirely on chutzpah, since he had no visible base of support and no political credentials whatsoever. Still, I decided to humor him and his ego trip, so I asked him questions about various local issues, as though his views on such matters were worthy of serious consideration. I brought up the concern over a recent rise in teenage violence, and Mailer was quick to offer a bold and imaginative remedy. The kids, he said, should not be disarmed, because to a male adolescent, the knife is an instrument of manhood. After extolling the heroic spirit of the Middle Ages, he proposed holding modern jousting tournaments between teenage gangs in Central Park. In the meantime, I had noticed Mailer was sporting a black eye, a real shiner, and when I asked him how he got it, Mailer replied, "Oh, I was in quite a scrape Saturday night." That was true enough, but it wasn't the whole story. Wallace points out that he wasn't aware, at the time the interview with Mailer was taped on Monday, that he had stabbed his wife. Nevertheless, once that news did become public, they went ahead and aired the interview on the night of Tuesday, November 22nd. After Mailer completed the taping with Wallace, he went back to the hospital to see Adele, who by this time did not want to see her husband at all. The hospital staff called the police, and Mailer was arrested and taken to a police station on 100th Street. Today, in New York, aggravated assault, that is, causing serious bodily harm to another person, usually with a weapon, is a felony. Depending on the circumstances, someone committing aggravated assault could receive a very high monetary fine, in addition to up to 10 years or more in prison. There are degrees of assault. Third-degree assault, which is a misdemeanor in New York, means that you were reckless and showed disregard for another person's safety, but that you didn't intend to cause physical harm. More on that to come. Back to Monday night, November 21st. While Norman Mailer was being held at the police station, he was examined by Adele's doctor, Dr. Conrad Rosenberg, who stated that he found Mailer to be experiencing an acute paranoid breakdown with delusional thinking, and that Mailer was both homicidal and suicidal. In Dr. Rosenberg's opinion, Mailer's admission to a hospital was urgently advised. The following day, on November 22nd, Norman Mailer was arraigned in felony court. An arraignment is a hearing before a judge in which the charges against the defendant are formally stated and a plea is entered. Before the magistrate, whose name was Reuben Levi, Mailer made the following statement. "Naturally, I have been a little upset, but I have never been out of my mental faculties. I only saw Dr. Rosenberg for 30 seconds or a minute. It's important to me not to be sent to a mental hospital, because my work in the future will be considered that of the disordered mind. My pride is that I can explore areas of experience that other men are afraid of. I insist I am sane." Whether or not Mailer was advised by his attorney to make this statement is unknown. asking a judge to think not of the law, but of the defendant's literary reputation is not exactly a winning strategy. As for Mailer's sanity, Judge Levi didn't take the defendant's word for it. In a statement that must have stung for Mailer, someone who made his living by writing fiction, Judge Levi said, "Your recent history indicates that you cannot distinguish fiction from reality. In your interest and the public interest, I have to commit you." That meant Mailer was being sent to Bellevue Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. In TV and in movies, and thus in the general perception of the public, Bellevue is known less for being the oldest public hospital in the United States and more for being the place where crazy and violent offenders are sent. Mailer, like all sane people, didn't want to go to jail, and he didn't want to be sent to Bellevue. There was, however, no third alternative. According to biographer Hilary Mills, Mailer worried if he wasn't crazy before he went to Bellevue, being in Bellevue would somehow make him crazy. Mailer was in Bellevue for a little over 2 weeks. On December 9th, 1960, he was declared sane and released. Bail was set at $2,500, which in today's money is approximately $20,000. Mailer paid it and was ordered to appear in felony court on December 21st. By this time, Adele Morales Mailer had been released from the hospital. By all accounts, she made a physical recovery, but one cannot make as speedy an emotional or psychological recovery from being stabbed by your own spouse. Adele did not yet leave her husband, and she did not yet file for divorce. On December 21st, and again at a court date on December 29th, Norman and Adele appeared at felony court together. They arrived as a couple. Photographers were there, encouraging the pair to smile for the camera, and they obliged. Adele refused to sign a complaint against her husband, and Mailer's new lawyer asked Judge Walter Gladwin to dismiss the case entirely, seeing as there was no complaint. The judge denied that request, and he set a new court date for January 12, 1961. On that date, Adele was called to the stand to testify. To questions from the assistant district attorney and from the judge about the events on the night of the stabbing, Adele gave the same response. She didn't remember what happened. She and her husband were, she said, perfectly happy together, and she had no interest in signing a complaint against anyone. The prosecution called witnesses, Adele's doctor, the Mailer's maid, the arresting detective, but Mailer's lawyer objected, calling again for the entire case to be dismissed. There was no signed complaint against his client, and the district attorney's office, representing the people of New York, had failed to make a prima facie case, meaning the evidence they presented was not suitable to proceed with a trial to prove that the defendant was guilty. Judge Gladwin agreed with the first point, there was no complaint, but on the second point he disagreed, ruling that there was enough evidence for the case to proceed to a grand jury. On January 30th, 1961, Norman Mailer was indicted by a grand jury on 2 counts of felonious assault and 1 count of possession of a dangerous weapon. Arraignment was scheduled for February 2nd. You're listening to the podcast A Writer's Crime, created and narrated by Tim Lemire. That's me. The musical theme of this podcast is the second movement of the Mandolin Concerto in C Major, RV 425, by Antonio Vivaldi. That piece, along with all the musical transitions in this podcast, are arranged and performed by guitarist-composer Raymond Gonzalez. You can find him online at raymondgonzalez.net. When someone is arrested for a crime and their mental state is in question, what's at issue fundamentally is if, in the commission of the crime, the person knows the difference between right and wrong. Some people who do wrong do not know that they are doing wrong, owing to the fact that they are mentally incapacitated, mentally ill, or insane. Other people do wrong knowing they are doing wrong in the hopes that they just won't get caught. But then there are people who do wrong who, knowing they are doing wrong, simply don't care. Because when it comes to themselves and their own actions, the concepts of right and wrong are immaterial. There is only what I want, or what I want to do. We heard in a previous episode of this podcast Adele Morales-Mailer stating that her husband stabbed her while he was experiencing a psychotic break, which means that he wasn't conscious of what he was doing. That may be so, or it may be Adele's way of rationalizing why her husband attacked her. He just didn't know what he was doing. There is other evidence to suggest that even if Mailer didn't know what he was doing on the night he stabbed his wife, he engaged in behavior immediately afterward that showed he didn't either fully appreciate the gravity of what he'd done, or he didn't care. We've one piece of evidence that he saw fit to be interviewed by Mike Wallace for television. The second is that shortly after being indicted by a grand jury for stabbing his wife, Norman Mailer decided to give a poetry reading. If you recall from our first episode, Norman Mailer's literary career in 1960 was in a rather precarious state. His first novel, The Naked and the Dead, was a bestseller and critically praised. But his next two novels, Barbary Shore and The Deer Park, fell far short of that debut. Mailer had tried, unsuccessfully, to write a column for the Village Voice, and while his contemporaries, Gore Vidal and Truman Capote, had adapted their own books for the stage with modest success, Mailer's own attempts to do so were less so. On February 6, 1961, Norman Mailer secured an engagement at the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan, what was then, and still is today, Carnegie Hall for writers. Was Mailer to read from a new novel or short story? If Mailer, as he told his judge, prided himself on exploring areas of experience that other men are afraid of, would he write an essay exploring why he attacked and nearly killed his wife? It was none of the above. At the 92nd Street Y, Mailer read from his poetry, or rather, what he called poetry. An example. Listen, my love, the hour is late. My side has an ache. If you don't get a taxi, my heart will break. Or another. So long as you use a knife, there's a little love left. That is pretty bad poetry. And on stage, Mailer impishly admitted it, telling his audience that hearing bad poetry enhanced their appreciation for good poetry. Periodically during his reading, Mailer asked his audience for a show of hands to see if anyone was offended by his work. Some people were, and thus, just like on the night he stabbed his wife, when he wanted to separate his guests into those who were for him and those who were against him, Mailer was again testing the waters to see what people thought of him. Bad poetry became a barrier that Mailer erected between himself and his audience. Behind it, he could adopt the persona of a hepcat, a pronouncer of koans, a street oracle. Bad poetry made Mailer sound gnomic, and fittingly, all his bad poems were short. He's in and he's out before you get a chance to object or mount a rebuttal. None of the poems were long enough or substantial enough to bear serious critical analysis. That did not stop Norman Mailer from later releasing a long-playing record, Norman Mailer Reads Norman Mailer. The organizers at the 92nd Street Y dropped the curtain on this performance owing to some of the language Mailer used in his so-called poetry. The words he used, kike and dyke, might strike us as relatively tame today, but in 1961, it was not the kind of language one used in public readings or performances. Mailer knew this, but he did it anyway. On March 9, 1961, Norman Mailer pled guilty to third-degree assault against his wife. As Hillary Mills reports, Mailer faced a possible sentence of a year in prison and a fine of $500. At a hearing on May 10th, Mailer's lawyer assured the presiding judge that his client has been and will be productive at the genius level. Evidently, Mailer's attorney believed that geniuses shouldn't receive harsh sentences. Even Adele, reportedly, asked the judge to be lenient with her husband. On November 13, 1961, Norman Mailer received a suspended sentence with a probation period not to exceed 3 years. Norman Mailer served no prison time, and he wasn't required to perform a single hour of community service. By that time, Norman and Adele were separated and would subsequently divorce. So, what happened next? Norman Mailer was not ostracized by his family or by most of his friends. Mailer biographer Carl Rollison writes that Mailer stabbing Adele magnified his mystique among his literary friends. He quotes playwright Lionel Abel as saying that at parties held by the literary journal Partisan Review, people such as Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt, and Mary McCarthy would, quote, pay court, end quote, to Norman and wanted to touch him. That is Abel's perception of things. If Sontag and company did feel that way toward Mailer, perhaps they were possessed of an ailment not uncommon among intellectuals, a fascination with violence, with criminality, with power. Mailer seemed to be, to borrow a title of a film Mailer made in 1968, Beyond the Law. Adele Mailer claimed that she did not pursue charges against her husband for the sake of their 2 children. But her 2 children were not witness to the event, and they were only 3 and 1 years old, respectively. Norman and Adele got divorced anyway, so it's not entirely clear what Adele hoped to spare her children, apart from the possible experience of visiting their father in prison. In December 1961, fresh into his probation, Norman Mailer attended a Christmas party hosted by his contemporary, Gore Vidal. There, Norman was introduced to a British socialite named Lady Jean Campbell. Mailer and Campbell were married the following year, in 1962. They had a daughter together, and in 1963, they were divorced. Our next episode will be the conclusion of this podcast. We'll look at some key events in Norman Mailer's life after 1960, and we'll find out what happened, finally, to Adele Morales Mailer. You've been listening to A Writer's Crime with me, Tim Lemire. Tune in for our next episode, and thanks very much for listening.